Welcome back to the deep dive. I want you to do something for me real quick. Picture this.
Okay, I am picturing it.
It is late. You're sitting around a campfire way out in the woods somewhere. The fire is crackling, popping, throwing those long, weird dancing shadows against the trees.
Oh, yeah, setting the mood.
Right. And it's that time of night where reality feels just a little bit thin. And you're sitting there with a friend, maybe it's me, and I reach into my bag and pull out a strange, dusty object.
Okay, what is it?
It looks like a mechanical box, maybe an old piece of audio equipment, maybe something totally alien. And I look you right in the eye and say, this machine here, this is the blueprint for your soul.
That is a very specific and honestly slightly spooky vibe you were setting right out of the gate, but I actually really love it.
Thanks, I worked on that.
It fits the material we have on the table today perfectly because we are dealing with something that feels a bit like a ghost story, a bit like a sci-fi technical manual, and a whole lot like an instruction guide for just being a conscious entity.
Right, exactly. Because today we are looking at a text that totally bridges the gap between the mechanical and the mystical. We are talking about time, but definitely not time as you know it.
Definitely
We're
not.
talking about the structure of the self, but not the self you see when you look in the mirror. And we are talking quite literally about a reel-to-reel tape recorder.
A massive, clunky 1960s reel-to-reel tape recorder, which, considering the date this material was produced, is just the perfect analog anchor for the metaphysics we are about to explore.
It really is. But before we get lost in the analog machinery of the soul, I have to ask the question that always comes up when we touch this specific material.
Oh, I know what you're going to ask.
Have we recorded this before? I mean, is there a probable version of us in some other dimension doing this exact deep dive way better than we are right now?
Well, if the source material is to be believed, there is almost certainly a version of us doing this better somewhere. There's probably also a version of us who decided to open a bakery instead of analyzing metaphysical texts.
I would buy a croissant from that guy.
Same. But let's try to make this version the best one, shall we? We'll stick to this frequency for now.
Deal. We will stay on this track. But before we jump in, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First off, a mandatory declaration for everyone listening out there.
Yes, very important.
This deep dive is distributed completely free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes. We are here to explore ideas, to learn, and to question things. We're not here to sell you a bridge to the fourth dimension or a subscription to a secret society.
But to be fair, if we did find a physical bridge to the fourth dimension, we would definitely do a deep dive on it.
Oh, absolutely we would.
But no, we are not selling it.
Exactly. So let's introduce the source of our campfire story today. We are cracking open the archives to look at session 231 of the early sessions, book 5 of the Seth Material.
And just to place this in time, this particular session was recorded on February 7, 1966.
Wow, 1966.
Yeah, it is fascinating to look back at that specific moment. The world was changing so rapidly, the counterculture was bubbling up, the Cold War was really freezing over, and yet in a quiet living room in Elmira, New York, this incredible, deep psychological exploration was taking place.
And we absolutely must give credit where it is due here. This material comes to us thanks to the New Awareness Network. They are the folks doing all the heavy lifting to keep these archives alive and in print.
It is a massive, massive undertaking. Publishing the Seth Sessions isn't just about printing a book. It is about preserving a daily log of a profound psychological phenomenon.
Right, it's so raw.
It's dense, it's raw, and it is unpolished, which is exactly why we love digging into it.
So what is our mission today? Why are we staring into the fire? We're going to unpack 3 main things. First, we're looking at Seth's inverted time concept and the wild idea that your thoughts are actual literal events.
That's a huge one.
Huge. Second, we are going to completely disassemble the human soul using the metaphor of a multitrack tape recorder.
Which sounds a bit reductive, comparing the soul to a machine. But as we will see, it is actually a brilliant way to understand how consciousness is layered. It might be one of the most practical metaphors Seth ever gave.
And third, we're going to look at the receipts. We are going to review a very specific ESP experiment from this exact session involving atomic bomb pamphlets and, of all things, license plates.
License plates and atomic bombs, it is a combination that only makes sense in the Seth Material.
It's a weird mix, but I promise it all connects. So let's jump right into section 1, the reality of thoughts and this concept of inverted time.
Let's do it.
So Seth starts this session with a bit of a bang. He brings up the inverted time system. Now, normally when I hear inverted time, my mind goes straight to sci-fi. I'm thinking Christopher Nolan movies, I'm thinking parallel universes way out in the deep cosmos somewhere.
Right. We are so conditioned by science fiction to think of these exotic physics concepts as being out there somewhere else, somewhere really far away.
Yeah, like you need a spaceship to get there.
Exactly. But Seth's opening assertion here is that this inverted time system operates completely within our own system. It is right here.
He literally says it operates under the nose of the ego.
Precisely. He says it simply is not the time system recognized by the ego. That is the key distinction to make here. It is not that it doesn't exist, it's that the part of you that identifies as I, the ego, the manager of your daily life, it just doesn't have the sensory equipment to acknowledge it.
Like a dog whistle.
Yes, perfect analogy. Just because you can't hear the whistle doesn't mean the dog isn't reacting to it. The signal is there, you're just tuned out of it.
And this leads to a really radical idea he throws out next.
Yeah.
He says, action is action, whether or not you perceive it.
This is the absolute cornerstone of the argument today, because we generally tend to define an event as something strictly physical.
Or like if I drop my coffee mug right now and it shatters everywhere, that is an event. If I punch the wall, that's an event. Physics can measure it.
Correct. But if you just sit there and think about dropping the mug or really intensely wish you could punch the wall, usually we categorize that as nothing.
Just brain static. It's imaginary. It doesn't count.
But Seth disagrees completely. In fact, he flips the entire script on us. He argues that thoughts, wishes, and desires are actual events. He says the human system responds fully as much to these events as it does to physical events.
Okay, let's drill down on that for a second, because that's huge. So if I sit here and vividly wish for a sandwich, or let's go deeper, if I vividly worry about losing my job, my system treats that worry as a reality.
In a very real physiological and psychological way, yes. The action of the wish or the action of the fear is real. It has true validity. It changes the electromagnetic energy of your psyche.
Wow.
Seth is saying that just because an action hasn't manifested as a physical object like your sandwich or a physical situation like getting fired, it absolutely doesn't mean the event didn't occur in reality.
It really blurs the line between subjective and objective. It implies that our inner life is just as solid, structurally speaking, as the chair I'm sitting on.
Thoughts are indeed events, therefore. That's how Seth states it. And he goes further to explain that these interactions, these deep wishes, are what actually influence the future physical events. The wish for the sandwich starts a chain reaction in this inverted time system that eventually down the line results in the physical sandwich.
So the physical event is just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. The physical event is just the final printout. The thought event is the code running in the background the whole time.
That is empowering, but also kind of terrifying, honestly. It means I can't just casually dismiss my intrusive thoughts as not real.
It definitely demands a much higher level of responsibility for your own mental landscape. But Seth does offer a mechanism for how we actually experience these non-physical events. He introduces this idea of the bleed-through.
I love that term, bleed through. It sounds so much like audio engineering.
Which is highly intentional given the tape recorder analogy we are building toward. He says that in the dream state, or in certain semi-conscious states, we actually experience these thought events that haven't become physical yet.
I have the quote here. He says, in the dream state, often portions of these probable events are experienced in a semi-conscious manner. This amounts to a bleed-through.
Right.
So when I dream about something that hasn't happened, I'm not just hallucinating.
No, you are tuning into that inverted time system where those events are actually occurring as probabilities. It is like you're driving your car and your ego is listening to its normal radio station. But for just a second, the signal fades and you hear a snippet of a song from a station 2 towns over.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
That station is, the song is actually playing even if you aren't currently physically there to hear the whole thing.
That is a perfect transition to the core metaphor of this session. Section 2. The tape recorder.
This is where Seth gets incredibly practical and grounded. We have to set the scene for the listener. Jane Roberts, the medium, is in a trance speaking as Seth. Her husband, Rob, is sitting right there taking meticulous notes.
Right.
And spinning away in the corner of the room is a physical, reel-to-reel tape recorder capturing the audio of the session.
And Seth points to this machine, this literal object sitting in the room, and essentially says, that machine, that is you.
It is brilliant because he uses the immediate physical environment to explain a really high-concept metaphysical idea. He says, imagine the whole self as composed of some master tape.
Okay, so I have a tape.
You are a master tape. Now, the recorder they had in the room in 1966 was a 4-channel machine, but Seth says, for the sake of the analogy, we will give our master tape Numberless channels.
Numberless, so infinite tracks. I am not just a solo singer-songwriter with an acoustic guitar. I am a full chaotic orchestra.
You are a massive symphony. And on a multi-track recorder, as you know, you can record completely different things on completely different tracks. You could have a heavy drum solo on track 1, a poetry reading on track 2, and just the sound of ocean waves on track 3.
Right, and they were all happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
But if I isolate just track 1, I might think the entire recording is nothing but drums.
Exactly. This is what Seth calls the illusion of separation. He introduces these terms mono 1 and mono 2. He equates mono 1 with the ego, the part of you that navigates daily life, pays the electric bill, drives the car. And mono 2 is the subconscious.
So my ego, let's call him the manager. The manager is sitting there on mono 1.
Yeah.
He has his headset on, but he is only plugged into channel 1.
Right.
And he is convinced, absolutely 100% convinced that he's the whole show. He's looking around saying, I am the reality. Everything else is just background noise.
Yes. Seth actually notes that it seems ridiculous to the whole self that the ego thinks this way. He says, you can see that it would be highly ridiculous to say that the material on your mono 1 was any more or any less valid than your material on mono 2.
Because they're the same tape.
Exactly. They are both just tracks on the exact same piece of tape. They are both you. But because they are separated by channels, they feel totally isolated.
It's almost like if your left hand thought it was the only hand in existence and treated the right hand as some kind of myth.
Or a ghost. You know, ooh, I felt a ghostly presence pick up that coffee cup. No, man, that was just your other hand.
I feel like my mono 1 is definitely a bit of a control freak. It really wants to believe it's the only track that matters, because if it admits there are other tracks, it loses its absolute authority.
Well, that is the fundamental nature of the ego. It thrives on strict definition and rigid boundaries. It says, I am this, and I am definitely not that. But here's where the analogy gets really profound. Seth points out a very specific switch on the physical recorder in the room.
The stereo setting.
The stereo setting. Let me pull the exact quote because it's crucial. He says, quote, now on your recorder, I believe you have a setting for stereo. This enables you to unite and combine harmoniously the elements on the various channels simultaneously, end quote.
Simultaneous harmony. So instead of hearing just the isolated drums or just the isolated vocals, you finally hear the full song.
Yes. And he equates this stereo setting to the inner ego.
Well, wait a second. We have the ego, which is mono 1, and now we have an inner ego too.
Correct. Think of the inner ego as the chief engineer or the main producer sitting at the mixing board in the studio. The inner ego is the director of the whole operation. It is the part of the self that can actually hear all the channels at once. It integrates all the different perceptions.
So the goal of being human, or the goal of spiritual growth or self-actualization or whatever you want to call it, is basically just finding the stereo switch.
In a manner of speaking, yes. Seth says the goal is for the separate parts, all those different channels, to realize they are part of the whole self. When the stereo function is turned on themselves, then know their unity.
That is genuinely beautiful. And I think it's important to note for anyone listening, you don't erase track 1 to do this. The goal isn't to kill the ego.
Exactly, and I'm so glad you brought that up. That is such a common misconception in a lot of spiritual circles. You don't wipe the tape, you don't erase the drums, you just let the drummer hear what the bass player is doing. You integrate them. Seth says their various realities merge in the overall perceptions of the whole self.
But until you hit that switch...
Until you hit that switch, the portions appear to themselves isolated to a large degree and alone.
Man, that explains so much about the basic human condition. That persistent, aching feeling of loneliness, of being somehow cut off from the rest of the universe. It's just because we are stuck in mono.
We are living in a stereo reality, but listening through a mono speaker.
Living in a stereo reality, but listening through a mono speaker? I am absolutely stealing that. That is going on a t-shirt.
Please do. But Seth adds one more really fascinating layer of complexity to this whole tape recorder thing. He says, we are not dealing, however, with anything as simple as a mechanical recorder, for our tapes and analogy are constantly changing.
Right, because we are alive.
Mm-hmm.
The music is actively being improvised in real time.
Yeah.
Which brings us nicely to section 3, the spacious present and the whole concept of time.
This creates a really fascinating conflict between the ego and the inner self. Seth explains that different selves or different channels actually experience time completely differently.
So mono one time is fundamentally different from mono two time.
Drastically different.
Yeah.
The ego on Mono 1 is completely obsessed with linear time, past, present, future. It absolutely needs that rigid structure to feel safe and secure.
It needs a coherent narrative, like I was born here, I went to school there, and I am doing this specific thing right now.
Precisely. Seth says the ego maintains its stability by looking backwards into its experience of its past and finding something of itself there. It constantly clings to the past. It is rigid by design. It defines itself strictly by what has already happened to it.
But the inner self, the stereo self.
The inner self lives in what Seth calls the spacious present. Imagine a bird's eye view from way up high where you can see the entire landscape of time all at once. The road behind you and the road stretching out ahead of you are both visible simultaneously.
So it doesn't have to constantly remember the past, because the past is just right over there, like looking at a spot on a map.
Essentially, yes. And because it has this incredibly broad view, it primarily deals with probabilities.
Probabilities. This is where the subconscious comes in as the big problem solver, right?
Yeah,
This part of the text really helped me understand my own gut instincts a lot better.
I agree. It's super practical. Seth explains that the subconscious basically acts as a scout for the ego. It is intimately acquainted with probabilities. It actively scans these potential futures, these events that haven't physically happened yet, to help the ego decide what to actually do.
So when I have a really strong gut feeling not to take a certain route to work on a Tuesday, or just a sudden random urge to call an old friend, that might actually be my subconscious mono 2 having scanned a probable future where there's a traffic jam or where my friend needs help.
That is exactly how Seth describes the mechanism. He says the subconscious views various probabilities with the purposes of the ego in mind and therefore aids the ego in its decisions. It is constantly running complex simulations in the background.
That is so incredibly helpful of it. But if the subconscious is just trying to help, why does the ego usually fight it tooth and nail? Why do we ignore our gut so often?
Because the ego is terrified of the method being used. Seth describes the basic psychological makeup of the inner self as chameleon-like.
Chameleon-like. That implies changing colors, constantly adapting to the environment.
Exactly. It changes freely with every single probability it explores. It is totally plastic in nature, incredibly flexible.
And the ego hates flexible. The ego likes concrete. The ego likes the plan with a capital P.
Seth puts it so beautifully here. To the ego, this flexibility looks like sheer chaos or deep instability. But to the inner self, the ego's rigid permanence looks like a suffocating trap.
It's literally a personality clash inside your own head. The ego is the uptight librarian who wants every single book alphabetized and color-coded. And the inner self is the improvisational jazz musician who just wants to catch a vibe.
That is a highly valid interpretation of the dynamic. Seth says permanence as the ego thinks of it would be an alien concept to these portions of the self, and to them, a highly distasteful concept.
Distasteful. I love that word choice. The inner self looks at your rigid, strict 5-year plan and just goes, ew, boring. Why would you want to do exactly that and nothing else?
Because strict rigidity drastically limits the value fulfillment of the action. The inner self inherently wants to explore all the variations. It wants to see what happens if you take the left turn instead of the right turn, just for the experience of it.
And this circles all the way back to the bleed-through we talked about. Sometimes the ego accidentally catches a glimpse of these probable futures, right?
Yes, very often in our dreams. Seth says when this does happen, it usually occurs as a bleed-through from the subconscious, from the dream state.
So a weird dream might not just be the random firing of sleepy neurons. It might be you actually experiencing a probable event that you ultimately didn't choose to manifest in physical life, but your soul still went ahead and experienced it on another track.
Exactly. The event is actual all the same, Seth says, and is experienced in variation.
Man, that makes you rethink every bizarre dream you've ever had. Maybe I actually did show up to work totally naked in some probable reality.
Well, let's just hope that was a probability you very wisely chose to avoid in this specific physical track. But yes, the continuity of the whole self is retained through all these wild variations. You are still fundamentally, you're just experiencing a different remix of the song.
Okay, so we have the heavy theory down, we have the tape recorder, we have the inverted time, we have the probable realities. It is a fantastic philosophical framework. But what I really love about Seth is that he isn't just a philosopher spinning ideas. He actually brings receipts. He demonstrates the mechanics in real time.
And this brings us right to section 4. The envelope experiment.
I love these practical tests so much. It really grounds all the woo-woo metaphysical stuff in something highly tangible. It's like, okay, you talk a really big game about the nature of consciousness, but now guess what's in my pocket?
Right, it's the ultimate test. So some context for the listener on how this worked. Jane Roberts, the woman Seth speaks through, would very often perform these live ESP experiments during the dictation sessions. Her husband Rob would seal a target object inside a double envelope totally blind to Jane. And Seth, speaking through Jane, would have to describe the contents.
Pure double-blind psychic testing in the living room. So this is envelope number 31. What was actually inside this one?
A printed leaflet. And specifically, it was a leaflet about highway signs to be used in case of an atomic attack.
Okay, well, that is extremely grim, very, very cold.
Very mid-1960s paranoia, yes.
And where on earth did they get this joyful piece of apocalyptic literature?
Rob and Jane had picked it up earlier at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, the DMV.
The DMV. The place where human souls actually go to die. So even in 1966, the DMV was apparently a waking nightmare.
It seems to be a universal constant across all timelines. In this case, yes, it was stressful. They were there actively arguing about some significantly delayed license plates. Rob had ordered the plates weeks ago. They hadn't arrived, and there was a lot of mounting anxiety about driving the car illegally. They saw this big stack of atomic attack leaflets sitting on the public counter and just picked one up, probably just to have something to distract them while they waited in line.
So fast forward to the actual session later on.
Yeah.
Jane is deep in a trance. She obviously cannot see the envelope. It's totally sealed. What does she say when asked to read it?
She starts getting a rapid series of impressions, and what's absolutely fascinating here, and this links directly back to our earlier point about thoughts acting as real events, is that she doesn't just read the paper inside like a human Xerox machine. She reads the entire emotional situation surrounding the paper.
Give us the specific hits. What did she actually get right?
First, she says there is some connection with a magistrate of some sort.
A magistrate. That implies a judge or some kind of high legal official.
Well, while they were at the DMV, they had interacted with a sheriff. He was wearing a full uniform, a prominent shoulder patch. He was the clear figure of authority in the room. The psychic impression picked up the concept of lawman or authority figure and simply translated it into the word magistrate.
Okay, yeah, that totally tracks. The underlying vibe was legal authority, and she nailed that. What else did she get?
She then says the numbers 3 and 12.
Just random numbers.
Not at all. Rob had officially ordered the delayed license plates on December 3rd, 12-3.
Wow. Okay, now that is incredibly specific. That is not just a vague feeling or a cold read. That is hard data.
Exactly. Then she says, occurrence not repeated.
What does that mean in this context?
The sheriff at the DMV had specifically told them that the Bureau was completely flooded with mail, which was a very rare event for them. It was a flood of new applications that caused the massive delay. It was a singular, unusual occurrence that backed the whole system up.
That is so interesting. So she picked up on the specific reason for the bureaucratic delay, which was obviously tied to Rob's emotional frustration about the whole thing.
Then she starts getting a visual of the people involved. She says 2 men, 1 taller.
And who are they supposed to be?
Rob is a very tall man. And they had a mutual friend, a local auto mechanic, who was notably short. This short mechanic had actually been the one who warned them to urgently check on the status of the plates. The psychic impression picked up the 2 specific men who were most energetically concerned with the car issue.
It's almost like the physical object, the paper leaflet, was deeply imbued with the energetic residue of the people who handled it and worried about it.
Yes, it's classic psychometry. The physical object acts as a magnetized recording tape of the psychic events that happened around it. She even manages to describe the leaflet itself visually. She says it had a gray color and strong uprights.
And was the leaflet gray?
The back of the pamphlet was over 2/3 solid gray, and the graphic design prominently featured bold vertical lines, strong uprights.
That is just incredibly precise for a completely blind reading of a sealed envelope.
But here is the really critical analysis point for us. Seth and Jane didn't just passively see the ink on the paper. They saw the emotional history connected to the paper.
The anxiety about the missing license plates.
And the underlying existential fear of the atomic attack itself. Remember, Jane had actually suffered a terrible nightmare about an atomic attack just days before they picked up that specific leaflet. The leaflet served as a physical anchor for that lingering fear.
So the ESP picked up the internal event of the fear, just like Seth said earlier in the session. Thoughts are events. The intense fear was just as real and readable as the paper itself.
Precisely. The emotional intensity is what makes the psychic signal strong enough to read. If Rob had just absent-mindedly picked up a random gum wrapper with zero emotion attached to it, the reading might have been totally blank. But because there was highly charged anxiety from the DMV and deep existential dread about an atomic bomb, the signal was deafeningly loud.
I also just have to laugh at the sheer absurdity that even in a profound mystical trance, communicating with a highly advanced non-physical entity, the mundane, petty annoyance of the local DMV still comes through loud and clear. She literally mentions connection with a note and money and a sweeping out. It's all just bureaucracy.
I think it beautifully proves that the spiritual world and the mundane world are not remotely separate things. They are recorded on the exact same tape, just on different channels. The agonizing DMV experience and the profound atomic fear experience were playing simultaneously on that section of the tape.
So Jane absolutely nails the envelope experiment. It's a massive win for the team. But the session wasn't all just high fives and victory laps, was it? We have to talk about Section 5. The oops moment.
Yes, we do. And this part is so very important because it deeply humanizes the medium. It shows clearly that this isn't some perfect, infallible cosmic transmission. There is real static on the line sometimes.
Right. So apparently in the session right before this one, session 230, Jane had made a rather serious prediction. And it was definitely not a happy one.
No, it was not. She had explicitly predicted their exact death dates. Specifically, she said that Rob would die at the age of 87, but that Jane would die much earlier.
Yikes. That is unbelievably heavy.
Ah.
I mean, imagine your spouse waking up from a deep trance and just casually saying, honey, I have some really bad news about my timeline. That would totally mess with your head.
Seth addresses this panic head-on right at the start of session 231. He calls the prediction a distortion.
Does he just throw Jane right under the bus?
In a way, yes, but very gently. He explains that it was definitively not his data coming through. He says Rupert's subconscious simply got in our way at last evening's session. And just for context, he always calls Jane by the male name Rupert.
Why, though? What actually happened to cause that bad data?
It was a classic fear response. Jane was rapidly approaching the specific age and the anniversary date of her own grandfather's sudden death.
Ah, the old grandfather trauma rearing its head.
Exactly. Subconsciously, she deeply identified with him. She knew his exact age at death, which was 67. And so her anxious subconscious projected that deep-seated fear directly onto the psychic session.
So the pure signal coming from Seth was probably reassuring, but Jane's mono 2, her subconscious basically hijacked the microphone and just screamed, we're going to die at 67.
That is pretty much exactly what happened. Seth says we had his identification with his grandfather momentarily and the subsequent distortion.
That is endlessly fascinating to me. It shows that even a naturally gifted high-level medium has internal static. It's exactly like when a microphone gets too close to a speaker and picks up that awful screeching feedback.
Seth explicitly points out that the subconscious can entirely hijack the signal when deep fear is present. It serves as a huge warning to anyone out there exploring their own intuition. Fear heavily distorts. If you are deeply afraid of the answer you are asking for, you will very likely get a wrong, heavily distorted answer.
But Seth does clean the mess up right. He reassures them both.
Yes, he does. He clearly says, unless drastic changes occur, the relatively old ages mentioned should stand up well. He essentially formally apologizes, saying, I would apologize to Rupert, but the distortion was not my own.
Sorry, guys, my organic channel is a bit glitchy today.
He squarely blames the whole thing on the mono 1, mono 2 conflict. The ego and the subconscious were actively tangling with each other, and the clear stereo signal completely got lost in the noise.
He also casually mentions yoga, which I found surprisingly funny. It feels so modern for 1966.
Yes, he notes that the yoga discipline is helping him more than he realizes. It is actively helping Jane physically stabilize her erratic nervous energy.
So do some downward dog, clear out your deep subconscious fear, and remember to turn on the stereo switch. That's the ultimate prescription here.
That certainly seems to be the core prescription. He also firmly says Jane should learn to completely trust her intuitional nature, for it is sturdier and more reliable than he knows.
That is a genuinely good message for all of us, I think. Trust the intuition. It's way sturdier than we usually think it is.
Indeed it is.
So bringing this all together, what does this actually mean for us? We have covered a massive amount of ground today, from the physics of inverted time to the mundane horrors of the DMV. Let's try to synthesize this for the listener who is maybe just trying to get through their morning commute right now.
I think the big central takeaway is that we are incredibly vast stereo beings currently living in what looks like a restricted mono world. We rigidly perceive ourselves as single, isolated tracks that ego layer, but we're actually part of a massive multi-channel symphony. We are far more vast and interconnected than we ever give ourselves credit for.
And our everyday thoughts, all those little fleeting daydreams, those passing wishes, those nagging fears, they are not just empty fluff, they are real events. They are concrete actions. We're constantly actively influencing our physical reality, even if we don't immediately see the physical result right in front of us.
And that license plate envelope experiment beautifully proves that the human mind can easily travel far outside physical limits. It can routinely access information and deep emotional history that the physical eyes simply cannot see. The universe's data is all right there if we just learn how to tune our internal receiver to it.
It's a hugely empowering idea, but I'll admit it's also a little bit scary. It means we really have to step up and be actively responsible for our own internal events.
We have to consciously curate our master tape. We have to decide what kind of energy we're consistently recording onto all those other invisible tracks.
Exactly. Well, we really hope you enjoyed this strange little look into the hidden mechanics of the soul. But please don't just take our word for all this. We are literally just the guys sitting at the campfire holding the weird dusty box.
No, definitely do not take our word for it. We barely even scratched the surface of the deep nuance here. You really need to read the original text for yourself.
Head over to sethcenter.com/the early sessions. Go find the books. Read session 231 for yourself. It is so much wilder and deeper than we can ever fully describe here.
There is a very specific hypnotic texture to Seth's voice in the written text that you just have to experience directly. It has a unique cadence that we simply cannot replicate secondhand.
Before we put the fire out today, we want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought. Just something to chew on while you go about your day.
We thoroughly established today that your thoughts are actual events. Seth says clearly that your wishes are real actions happening in a probable reality.
So if your private wishes are actual literal events playing out in a probable reality right now, what exact kind of world are you actively building with the random daydream you are having while listening to us talk?
Are you currently building a tragedy? Are you building a comedy? Or are you building a stressful thriller?
You are the sole recording engineer of your own massive reality tape. Check your audio levels.
And remember to turn on the stereo.
See you in the spacious present.